The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 3. John Thorndyke. That the character of an individual tends to be reflected in his dress is a fact familiar to the least observant. That the observation is equally applicable to aggregates of men is less familiar, but equally true. Do not the members of the fighting professions, even to this day, deck themselves in feathers, in gaudy colors and gilded ornaments, after the manner of the African war chief or the red-skin brave, and thereby indicate the place of war in modern civilization? Does not the Church of Rome send her priests to the altar in habiliments that were fashionable before the fall of the Roman Empire, in token of her immovable conservatism? And lastly, does not the law, lumbering on in the wake of progress, symbolize its subjection to precedent by headgear reminiscent of the days of good Queen Anne? I should apologize for obtruding upon the reader these somewhat trite reflections, which were set going by the quaint stock-in-trade of a wig-maker's shop in the cloisters of the Inner Temple, whither I had strayed on a sultry afternoon in quest of shade and quiet. I had halted opposite the little shop window, and with my eyes bent dreamily on the row of wigs, was pursuing the above train of thought, when I was startled by a deep voice saying softly in my ear, "I'd have the full-bottomed one if I were you." I turned swiftly and rather fiercely, and looked into the face of my old friend and fellow student, Jervis, behind whom, regarding us with a sedate smile, stood my former teacher, Dr. John Thorndyke. Both men greeted me with a warmth that I felt to be very flattering, for Thorndyke was quite a great personage, and even Jervis was several years my academic senior. "You are coming in to have a cup of tea with us, I hope," said Thorndyke, and as I assented gladly, he took my arm and led me across the court in the direction of the treasury. "But why that hungry gaze at those forensic vanities, Berkeley?" he asked. "Are you thinking of following my example and Jervis's, deserting the bedside for the bar?" "What! Has Jervis gone into the law?" I exclaimed. "Bless you, yes," replied Jervis. "I have become parasitical upon Thorndyke. The big fleas have little fleas, you know. I am the additional fraction trailing after the whole number in the rear of a decimal point." "Don't you believe him, Berkeley," interposed Thorndyke. "He's the brains of the firm. I supply the respectability and moral worth. But you haven't answered my question. What are you doing here on a summer afternoon staring into a wig-maker's window?" "I am Barnard's locum. He is in practice in Fetter Lane." "I know," said Thorndyke. "We meet him occasionally, and very pale and peaky he has been looking of late. Is he taking a holiday?" "Yes, he has gone for a trip to the Isles of Greece in a currant ship." "Then," said Jervis, "you are actually a local G.P. I thought you were looking beastly respectable." "And judging from your leisured manner when we encountered you," added Thorndyke, "the practice is not a strenuous one. I suppose it is entirely local?" "Yes," I replied. "The patients mostly live in the small streets and courts within a half-mile radius of the surgery, and the abodes of some of them are pretty squalid. Oh, and that reminds me of a very strange coincidence. It will interest you, I think." "Life is made up of strange coincidences," said Thorndyke. "Nobody but a reviewer of novels is ever really surprised at a coincidence. But what is yours?" "It is connected with a case that you mentioned to us at the hospital about 2 years ago, the case of a man who disappeared under rather mysterious circumstances. Do you remember it? The man's name was Bellingham." "The Egyptologist? Yes, I remember the case quite well. What about it?" "The brother is a patient of mine. He is living in Neville's Court with his daughter, and they seem to be as poor as church mice." "Really?" said Thorndyke. "This is quite interesting. They must have come down in the world rather suddenly.
If I remember rightly, the brother was living in a house of some pretensions standing in its own grounds." "Yes, that is so. I see you recollect all about the case." "My dear fellow," said Jervis, "Thorndyke never forgets a likely case. He is a sort of medico-legal camel. He gulps down the raw facts from the newspapers or elsewhere, and then, in his leisure moments, he calmly regurgitates them and has a quiet chew at them. It is a quaint habit. A case crops up in the papers or in one of the courts, and Thorndyke swallows it whole. Then it lapses, and everyone forgets it. A year or two later it crops up in a new form, and to your astonishment you find that Thorndyke has got it all cut and dried. He has been ruminating on it periodically in the interval." "You notice," said Thorndyke, "that my learned friend is pleased to indulge in mixed metaphors. But his statement is substantially true, though obscurely worded. You must tell us more about the Bellinghams when we have fortified you with a cup of tea." Our talk had brought us to Thorndyke's chambers, which were on the first floor of No. 5A King's Bench Walk, and as we entered the fine, spacious, paneled room, we found a small elderly man, neatly dressed in black, setting out the tea service on the table. I glanced at him with some curiosity. He hardly looked a servant, in spite of his neat black clothes. In fact, his appearance was rather puzzling, for while his quiet dignity and his serious, intelligent face suggested some kind of professional man, his neat, capable hands were those of a skilled mechanic. Thorndyke surveyed the tea tray thoughtfully and then looked at his retainer. "I see you have put 3 teacups, Polton," he said. "Now, how did you know I was bringing someone in to tea?" The little man smiled a quaint, crinkly smile of gratification as he explained. "I happened to look out the laboratory window as you turned the corner, sir." "How disappointingly simple," said Jervis. "We were hoping for something abstruse and telepathic."
"Simplicity is the soul of efficiency, sir," replied Polton, as he checked the tea service to make sure that nothing was forgotten, and with this remarkable aphorism he silently evaporated. "To return to the Bellingham case," said Thorndyke, when he had poured out the tea, "have you picked up any facts relating to the parties? Any facts, I mean, of course, that it would be proper for you to mention?" "I have learned 1 or 2 things that there is no harm in repeating. For instance, I gather that Godfrey Bellingham, my patient, lost all his properties quite suddenly about the time of the disappearance."
"That is really odd," said Thorndyke. "The opposite condition would be quite understandable, but one doesn't see exactly how this could have happened, unless there was an allowance of some sort." "No, that was what struck me. But there seem to be some queer features in the case, and the legal position is evidently getting complicated. There is a will, for example, which is giving trouble." "They will hardly be able to administer the will without either proof or presumption of death," Thorndyke remarked. "Exactly. That's one of the difficulties. Another is that there seems to be some fatal defect in the drafting of the will itself. I don't know what it is, but I expect I shall hear sooner or later. By the way, I mentioned the interest that you had taken in the case, and I think Bellingham would have liked to consult you, but of course the poor devil has no money." "That is awkward for him, if the other interested parties have. There will probably be legal proceedings of some kind, and as the law takes no account of poverty, he is likely to go to the wall. He ought to have advice of some sort." "I don't see how he is to get it," said I. "Neither do I," Thorndyke admitted. "There are no hospitals for impecunious litigants. It is assumed that only persons of means have a right to go to law. Of course, if we knew the man and the circumstances, we might be able to help him, but for all we know to the contrary, he may be an arrant scoundrel." I recalled the strange conversation that I had overheard, and wondered what Thorndyke would have thought if it had been allowable for me to repeat it. Obviously it was not, however, and I could only give my own impressions. "He doesn't strike me as that," I said, "but of course one never knows. Personally, he impressed me rather favorably, which is more than the other man did." "What other man?" asked Thorndyke. "There was another man in the case, wasn't there? I forget his name. I saw him at the house and didn't much like the look of him. I suspect he's putting some sort of pressure on Bellingham." "Barclay knows more about this than he is telling us," said Jervis. "Let us look up the report and see who this stranger is." He took down from a shelf a large volume of newspaper cuttings and laid it on the table. "You see," said he, as he ran his finger down the index, "Thorndyke files all the cases that are likely to come to something, and I know he had expectations respecting this one. I fancy he had some ghoulish hope that the missing gentleman's head might turn up in somebody's dustbin. Here we are. The other man's name is Hurst. He is apparently a cousin, and it was at his house that the missing man was last seen alive." "So you think Mr. Hurst is moving in the matter?" said Thorndyke, when he had glanced over the report. "That is my impression," I replied, "though I really know nothing about it." "Well," said Thorndyke, "if you should learn what is being done, and should have permission to speak of it, I shall be very interested to hear how the case progresses, and if an unofficial opinion on any point would be of service, I think there would be no harm in my giving it." "It would certainly be of great value if the other parties are taking professional advice," I said, and then, after a pause, I asked, "Have you given this case much consideration?" Thorndyke reflected. "No," he said, "I can't say that I have. I turned it over rather carefully when the report first appeared, and I have speculated on it occasionally since. It is my habit, as Jervis was telling you, to utilize odd moments of leisure, such as a railway journey, for instance, by constructing theories to account for the facts of such obscure cases as have come to my notice. It is a useful habit, I think, for, apart from the mental exercise and experience that one gains from it, an appreciable proportion of these cases ultimately come into my hands, and then the previous consideration of them is much time gained." "Have you formed any theory to account for the facts in this case?" I asked. "Yes. I have several theories, one of which I especially favor, and I am waiting with great interest such new facts as may indicate to me which of these theories is probably the correct one." "It's no use your trying to pump him, Berkeley," said Jervis. "He is fitted with an information valve that opens inward. You can pour in as much as you like, but you can't get any out." Thorndyke chuckled. "My learned friend is in the main correct," he said. "You see, I may be called upon any day to advise on this case, in which event I should feel remarkably foolish if I had already expounded my views in detail. But I should like to hear what you and Jervis make of the case as reported in the newspapers." "There now," exclaimed Jervis. "What did I tell you? He wants to suck our brains." "As far as my brain is concerned," I said, "the process of suction isn't likely to yield much except a vacuum, so I will resign in favor of you. You are a full-blown lawyer, whereas I am only a simple G.P." Jervis filled his pipe with deliberate care and lighted it. Then, blowing a slender stream of smoke into the air, he said, "If you want to know what I make of the case from that report, I can tell you in one word. Nothing. Every road seems to end in a cul-de-sac." "Oh, come," said Thorndyke. "This is mere laziness. Barclay wants to witness a display of your forensic wisdom. A learned counsel may be in a fog. He very often is. But he doesn't state the fact baldly. He wraps it up in a decent verbal disguise. Tell us how you arrive at your conclusion. Show us that you have really weighed the facts." "Very well," said Jervis. I will give you a masterly analysis of the case, leading to nothing." He continued to puff at his pipe for a time with slight embarrassment, as I thought, and I fully sympathized with him. Finally he blew a little cloud and commenced. "The position appears to be this. Here is a man who is seen to enter a certain house, who is shown into a certain room and shut in. He is not seen to come out, and yet when the room is next entered, it is found to be empty, and that man is never seen again, alive or dead. That is a pretty tough beginning. Now, it is evident that one of three things must have happened. Either he must have remained in that room, or at least in that house, alive, or he must have died, naturally or otherwise, and his body have been concealed, or he must have left the house unobserved. Let us take the first case. This affair happened nearly 2 years ago. Now, he couldn't have remained alive in the house for 2 years. He would have been noticed. The servants, for instance, when cleaning out the rooms, would have observed him." Here Thorndyke interposed with an indulgent smile at his junior. "My learned friend is treating the inquiry with unbecoming levity. We accept the conclusion that the man did not remain in the house alive." "Very well. Then did he remain in it dead? Apparently not. The report says that as soon as the man was missed, Hurst and the servants together searched the house thoroughly, but there had been no time or opportunity to dispose of the body, whence the only possible conclusion is that the body was not there. Moreover, if we admit the possibility of his having been murdered, for that is what concealment of the body would imply, there is the question, who could have murdered him? Not the servants, obviously, and as to Hurst, well, of course, we don't know what his relations with the missing man have been. At least, I don't." "Neither do I," said Thorndyke. "I know nothing beyond what is in the newspaper report and what Barclay has told us." "Then we know nothing. He may have had a motive for murdering the man, or he may not. The point is that he doesn't seem to have had the opportunity. Even if we suppose that he managed to conceal the body temporarily, still there was the final disposal of it. He couldn't have buried it in the garden with the servants about, neither could he have burned it. The only conceivable method by which he could have got rid of it would have been that of cutting it up into fragments and burying the dismembered parts in some secluded spots, or dropping them into ponds or rivers. But no remains of the kind have been found, as some of them probably would have been by now, so that there is nothing to support this suggestion. Indeed, the idea of murder, in this house at least, seems to be excluded by the search that was made the instant the man was missed. Then to take the third alternative, did he leave the house unobserved? Well, it is not impossible, but it would be a queer thing to do. He may have been an impulsive or eccentric man. We can't say. We know nothing about him. But 2 years have elapsed, and he has never turned up, so that if he left the house secretly, he must have gone into hiding and be hiding still. Of course, he may have been the sort of lunatic who would behave in that manner, or he may not. We have no information as to his personal character. Then there is the complication of the scarab that was picked up in the grounds of his brother's house at Woodford. That seems to show that he visited that house at some time, but no one admits having seen him there, and it is uncertain, therefore, whether he went first to his brother's house or to Hurst's. If he was wearing the scarab when he arrived at the Eltham house, he must have left that house unobserved and gone to Woodford. But if he was not wearing it, he probably went from Woodford to Eltham, and there finally disappeared. As to whether he was or was not wearing the scarab when he was last seen alive by Hurst's housemaid, there is at present no evidence. If he went to his brother's house after his visit to Hurst, The disappearance is more understandable, if we don't mind flinging accusations of murder about rather casually, for the disposal of the body would be much less difficult in that case. Apparently, no one saw him enter the house, and if he did enter, it was by a back gate which communicated with the library, a separate building some distance from the house. In that case, it would have been physically possible for the Bellinghams to have made away with him. There was plenty of time to dispose of the body unobserved, temporarily at any rate. Nobody had seen him come to the house, and nobody knew that he was there, if he was there, and apparently no search was made either at that time or afterwards. In fact, if it could be shown that the missing man ever left Hurst's house alive, or that he was wearing the scarab when he arrived there, things would look rather fishy for the Bellinghams, for, of course, the girl must have been in it if the father was. But there's the crux. There is no proof that the man ever did leave Hurst's house alive. And if he didn't... But there, as I said at first, whichever turning you take, you find that it ends in a blind alley. A lame ending to a masterly exposition, was Thorndyke's comment. I know, said Jervis, but what would you have? There are quite a number of possible solutions, and one of them must be the true one. But how are we to judge which it is? I maintain that until we know something of the parties and the financial and other interests involved, we have no data. There, said Thorndyke, I disagree with you entirely. I maintain that we have ample data. You say that we have no means of judging which of the various possible solutions is the true one. But I think that if you will read the report carefully and thoughtfully, you will find that the facts now known to us point clearly to one explanation, and one only. It may not be the true explanation, and I don't suppose it is. But we are now dealing with the matter speculatively, academically, and I contend that our data yield a definite conclusion. What do you say, Barclay? I say that it is time for me to be off. The evening consultations begin at 6:30. Well, said Thorndyke, don't let us keep you from your duties, with poor Barnard currant-picking in the Grecian Isles. But come in and see us again. Drop in when you like, after your work is done. You won't be in our way, even if we are busy, which we very seldom are after 8 o'clock. I thanked Dr. Thorndyke most heartily for making me free of his chambers in this hospitable fashion, and took my leave, setting forth homewards by way of Middle Temple Lane and the Embankment. Not a very direct route for Fetter Lane, it must be confessed, but our talk had revived my interest in the Bellingham household and put me in a reflective vein. From the remarkable conversation that I had overheard, it was evident that the plot was thickening. Not that I supposed that these two respectable gentlemen really suspected one another of having made away with the missing man, but still, their unguarded words, spoken in anger, made it clear that each had allowed the thought of sinister possibilities to enter his mind. A dangerous condition that might easily grow into actual suspicion. And then the circumstances really were highly mysterious, as I realized with especial vividness now after listening to my friend's analysis of the evidence. From the problem itself my mind traveled, not for the first time during the last few days, to the handsome girl who had seemed, in my eyes, the high priestess of this temple of mystery in the quaint little court. What a strange figure she made against this strange background, with her quiet, chilly, self-contained manner, her pale face so sad and worn, her black, straight brows and solemn gray eyes, so inscrutable, mysterious, sibylline. A striking, even impressive personality this, I reflected, with something in it somber and enigmatic that attracted and yet repelled. And here I recalled Jervis's words, "The girl must have been in it if the father was." It was a dreadful thought, even though only speculatively uttered, and my heart rejected it with an indignation that rather surprised me. And this notwithstanding that the somber, black-robed figure that my memory conjured up was one that associated itself appropriately enough with the idea of mystery and tragedy. End of chapter.
The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 4. Legal Complications and a Jackal. My meditations brought me by a circuitous route, and 10 minutes late, to the end of Fetter Lane, where, exchanging my rather abstracted air for the alert manner of a busy practitioner, I strode forward briskly and darted into the surgery with knitted brows, as though just released from an anxious case. But there was only one patient waiting, and she saluted me as I entered with a snort of defiance. "Here you are, then," said she. "You are perfectly correct, Miss Oman," I replied. "In fact, you have put the case in a nutshell. What can I have the pleasure of doing for you?" "Nothing," was the answer. "My medical adviser is a lady, but I've brought a note from Mr. Bellingham. Here it is." And she thrust the envelope into my hand. I glanced through the note and learned that my patient had had a couple of bad nights and a very harassing day. "Could I have something to give me a night's rest?" it concluded. I reflected a few moments. One is not very ready to prescribe sleeping draughts for unknown patients, but still, insomnia is a very distressing condition. In the end, I temporized with a moderate dose of bromide, deciding to call and see if more energetic measures were necessary. "He had better take a dose of this at once, Miss Oman," said I, as I handed her the bottle, "and I will look in later and see how he is." "I expect he will be glad to see you," she answered, "for he is all alone tonight and very dumpy. Miss Bellingham is out. But I must remind you that he's a poor man and pays his way. You must excuse my mentioning it." "I am very much obliged to you for the hint, Miss Oman," I rejoined. "It isn't necessary for me to see him, but I should like just to look in and have a chat." "Yes, it will do him good. You have your points, though punctuality doesn't seem to be one of them." And with this parting shot, Miss Oman bustled away. 8:30 found me ascending the great dim staircase of the house in Neville's Court, preceded by Miss Oman, by whom I was ushered into the room. Mr. Bellingham, who had just finished some sort of meal, was sitting hunched up in his chair, gazing gloomily into the empty grate. He brightened up as I entered, but was evidently in very low spirits. "I didn't mean to drag you out after your day's work was finished," he said, "though I am very glad to see you." "You haven't dragged me out. I heard you were alone, so I just dropped in for a few minutes' gossip." "That is really kind of you," he said heartily, "but I'm afraid you'll find me rather poor company. A man who is full of his own highly disagreeable affairs is not a desirable companion." "You mustn't let me disturb you if you'd rather be alone," said I, with a sudden fear that I was intruding. "Oh, you won't disturb me," he replied, adding with a laugh, "It's more likely to be the other way about. In fact, if I were not afraid of boring you to death, I would ask you to let me talk my difficulties over with you." "You won't bore me," I said. "It is generally interesting to share another man's experiences without their inconveniences. The proper study of mankind is man, you know, especially to a doctor." Mr. Bellingham chuckled grimly. "You make me feel like a microbe," he said. "However, if you would care to take a peep at me through your microscope, I will crawl onto the stage for your inspection, though it is not my actions that furnish the materials for your psychological studies. I am only a passive agent. It is my poor brother who is the deus ex machina, who from his unknown grave, as I fear, pulls the strings of this infernal puppet show." He paused, and for a space gazed thoughtfully into the grate, as if he had forgotten my presence. At length he looked up and resumed, "It is a curious story, Doctor, a very curious story.
Part of it you know, the middle part. I will tell it you from the beginning, and then you will know as much as I do, for as to the end, that is known to no one. It is written, no doubt, in the book of destiny, but the page has yet to be turned. The mischief began with my father's death. He was a country clergyman of very moderate means, a widower with 2 children, my brother John and me. He managed to send us both to Oxford, after which John went into the Foreign Office, and I was to have gone into the church. But I suddenly discovered that my views on religion had undergone a change that made this impossible. And just about this time, my father came into a quite considerable property. Now, as it was his expressed intention to leave the estate equally divided between my brother and me, there was no need for me to take up any profession for a livelihood. Archaeology was already the passion of my life, and I determined to devote myself henceforth to my favorite study, in which, by the way, I was following a family tendency, for my father was an enthusiastic student of ancient Oriental history, and John was, as you know, an ardent Egyptologist. Then my father died quite suddenly and left no will. He had intended to have one drawn up, but had put it off until it was too late, and since nearly all the property was in the form of real estate, my brother inherited practically the whole of it. However, in deference to the known wishes of my father, he made me an allowance of $500 a year, which was about a quarter of the annual income. I urged him to assign me a lump sum, but he refused to do this. Instead, he instructed his solicitor to pay me the allowance in quarterly installments during the rest of his life, and it was understood that on his death the entire estate should devolve upon me, or, if I died first, on my daughter Ruth. Then, as you know, he disappeared suddenly, and as the circumstances suggested that he was dead, and there was no evidence that he was alive, his solicitor, a Mr. Jellicoe, found himself unable to continue the payment of the allowance. On the other hand, as there was no positive evidence that my brother was dead, it was impossible to administer the will. You say that the circumstances suggested that your brother was dead. What circumstances were they? Principally the suddenness and completeness of the disappearance. His luggage, as you may remember, was found lying unclaimed at the railway station. And there was another circumstance even more suggestive. My brother drew a pension from the Foreign Office, for which he had to apply in person, or, if abroad, produce proof that he was alive on the date when the payment became due. Now, he was exceedingly regular in this respect. In fact, he had never been known to fail, either to appear in person or to transmit the necessary documents to his agent, Mr. Jellicoe. But from the moment when he vanished so mysteriously to the present day, nothing whatever has been heard of him. It's a very awkward position for you, I said, but I should think there will not be much difficulty in obtaining the permission of the court to presume death and to proceed to prove the will. Mr. Bellingham made a wry face. I expect you are right, he said, but unfortunately that doesn't help me much. You see, Mr. Jellicoe, having waited a reasonable time for my brother to reappear, took a very unusual, but, I think in the special circumstances, a very proper step. He summoned me and the other interested party to his office, and communicated to us the provisions of the will. And very extraordinary provisions they turned out to be. I was thunderstruck when I heard them. And the exasperating thing is that I feel sure my poor brother imagined that he had made everything perfectly safe and simple. They generally do, I said, rather vaguely. I suppose they do, said Mr. Bellingham, but poor John has made the most infernal hash of his will, and I am certain that he has utterly defeated his own intentions. You see, we are an old London family. The house in Queen Square, where my brother nominally lived, but actually kept his collection, has been occupied by us for generations, and most of the Bellinghams are buried in St. George's burial ground close by, though some members of the family are buried in other churchyards in the neighborhood. Now, my brother, who, by the way, was a bachelor, had a strong feeling for the family traditions, and he stipulated, not unnaturally, in his will, that he should be buried in St. George's burial ground among his ancestors, or at least in one of the places of burial appertaining to his native parish. But instead of simply expressing the wish and directing his executors to carry it out, he made it a condition affecting the operation of the will. "Affecting it in what respect?" I asked. "In a very vital respect," answered Mr. Bellingham. "The bulk of the property he bequeathed to me, or, if I predeceased him, to my daughter Ruth, but the bequest was subject to the condition that I have mentioned, that he should be buried in a certain place, and if that condition was not fulfilled, the bulk of the property was to go to my cousin, George Hurst." "But in that case," said I, "as you can't produce the body, neither of you can get the property." "I am not so sure of that," he replied. "If my brother is dead, it is pretty certain that he is not buried in St. George's or in any of the other places mentioned, and the fact can easily be proved by production of the registers, so that a permission to presume death would result in the handing over to Hurst of almost the entire estate." "Who is the executor?" I asked. "Ah," he exclaimed, "there is another muddle. There are two executors. Jellicoe is one, and the other is the principal beneficiary, Hurst or myself, as the case may be. But you see, neither of us can become an executor until the court has decided which of us is the proper beneficiary." "But who is to apply to the court? I thought that was the business of the executors." "Exactly. That is Hurst's difficulty. We were discussing it when you called the other day, and a very animated discussion it was," he added with a grim smile. "You see, Jellicoe naturally refuses to move in the matter alone. He says he must have the support of the other executor. But Hurst is not at present the other executor, neither am I. But the two of us together are the co-executor, since the duty devolves upon one or other of us in any case." "It's a complicated position," I said. "It is, and the complication has elicited a very curious proposal from Hurst. He points out, quite correctly I am afraid, that as the conditions as to burial have not been complied with, the property must come to him, and he proposes a very neat little arrangement, which is this: that I shall support him and Jellicoe in their application for permission to presume death and administer the will, and that he shall pay me $400 a year for life, the arrangement to hold good in all eventualities." "What does he mean by that?" "He means," said Bellingham, fixing me with a ferocious scowl, "that if the body should turn up at any future time, so that the conditions as to burial should be able to be carried out, he should still retain the property and pay me the $400 a year." "The deuce!" said I. "He seems to know how to drive a bargain." "His position is that he stands to lose $400 a year for the term of my life if the body is never found, and he ought to stand to win if it is." "And I gather that you have refused his offer?" "Yes, very emphatically, and my daughter agrees with me. But I am not sure that I have done the right thing. A man should think twice, I suppose, before he burns his boats." "Have you spoken to Mr. Jellicoe about the matter?" "Yes, I have been to see him today. He is a cautious man, and he doesn't advise me one way or the other. But I think he disapproves of my refusal. In fact, he remarked that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, especially when the whereabouts of the bush are unknown." "Do you think that he will apply to the court without your sanction?" "He doesn't want to, but I suppose if Hurst puts pressure on him, he will have to. Besides, Hurst, as an interested party, could apply on his own account, and after my refusal he probably will. At least, that is Jellicoe's opinion."
"The whole thing is a most astonishing muddle," I said, "especially when one remembers that your brother had a lawyer to advise him. Didn't Mr. Jellicoe point out to him how absurd the provisions were?"
"Yes, he did. He tells me that he implored my brother to let him draw up a will embodying the matter in a reasonable form. But John wouldn't listen to him. Poor old fellow, he could be very pig-headed when he chose."
"And is Hurst's proposal still open?"
"No, thanks to my peppery temper. I refused it very definitely, and sent him off with a flea in his ear. I hope I have not made a false step. I was quite taken by surprise when Hurst made the proposal, and got rather angry. You remember, my brother was last seen alive at Hurst's house. But there, I oughtn't to talk like that, and I oughtn't to pester you with my confounded affairs when you have come in for a friendly chat, though I gave you fair warning, you remember."
"Oh, but you have been highly entertaining. You don't realize what an interest I take in your case."
Mr. Bellingham laughed somewhat grimly. "My case?" he repeated. "You speak as if I were some rare and curious sort of criminal lunatic. However, I'm glad you find me amusing. It's more than I find myself."
"I didn't say amusing, I said interesting. I view you with deep respect as the central figure of a stirring drama, and I am not the only person who regards you in that light. Do you remember my speaking to you of Dr. Thorndyke?"
"Yes, of course I do."
"Well, oddly enough, I met him this afternoon, and we had a long talk at his chambers. I took the liberty of mentioning that I had made your acquaintance. Did I do wrong?"
"No, certainly not. Why shouldn't you tell him? Did he remember my infernal case, as you call it?"
"Perfectly, in all its details. He is quite an enthusiast, you know, and uncommonly keen to hear how the case develops."
"So am I, for that matter," said Mr. Bellingham.
"I wonder," said I, "if you would mind my telling him what you have told me tonight. It would interest him enormously." Mr. Bellingham reflected a while with his eyes fixed on the empty grate. Presently he looked up and said slowly,
"I don't know why I should. It's no secret, and if it were, I hold no monopoly in it. No, tell him if you think he'd care to hear about it."
"You needn't be afraid of his talking," I said. "He is as close as an oyster, and the facts may mean more to him than to us. He may be able to give a useful hint or two."
"Oh, I'm not going to pick his brains," Mr. Bellingham said quickly and with some wrath. "I'm not the sort of man who goes round cadging for free professional advice. Understand that clearly, Doctor."
"I do," I answered hastily. "That wasn't what I meant at all. Is that Miss Bellingham coming in? I heard the front door shut."
"Yes, that will be my girl, I expect. But don't run away. You're not afraid of her, are you?" he added, as I hurriedly picked up my hat.
"I'm not sure that I'm not," I answered. "She is a rather majestic young lady." Mr. Bellingham chuckled and smothered a yawn, and at that moment his daughter entered the room, and in spite of her shabby black dress and a shabbier handbag that she carried, I thought her appearance and manner fully justified my description. "You come in, Miss Bellingham," I said as she shook my hand with cool civility, "to find your father yawning and me taking my departure. So I have my uses, you see. My conversation is the infallible cure for insomnia." Miss Bellingham smiled. "I believe I am driving you away," she said. "Not at all," I replied hastily. "My mission was accomplished, that was all."
"Sit down for a few minutes, Doctor," urged Mr. Bellingham, "and let Ruth sample the remedy. She will be affronted if you run away as soon as she comes in."
"Well, you mustn't let me keep you up," I said.
"Oh, I'll let you know when I fall asleep," he replied with a chuckle,
and with this understanding I sat down again.
not at all unwillingly. At this moment, Miss Oman entered with a small tray and a smile of which I should not have supposed her to be capable. "You'll take your toast and cocoa while they're hot, dear, won't you?" she said coaxingly. "Yes, I will, Phyllis. Thank you," Miss Bellingham answered. "I am only just going to take off my hat." And she left the room, followed by the astonishingly transfigured spinster. She returned almost immediately, as Mr. Bellingham was in the midst of a profound yawn, and sat down to her frugal meal, when her father mystified me considerably by remarking, "You're late tonight, chick. Have the Shepherd Kings been giving trouble?" "No," she replied, "but I thought I might as well get them done, so I dropped in at the Ormond Street Library on my way home and finished them." "Then they are ready for stuffing now?" "Yes." As she answered, she caught my astonished eye, for a stuffed shepherd king is undoubtedly a somewhat surprising phenomenon, and laughed softly. "We mustn't talk in riddles like this," she said, "before Dr. Barclay, or he will turn us both into pillars of salt. My father is referring to my work," she explained to me. "Are you a taxidermist, then?" I asked. She hastily set down the cup that she was raising to her lips, and broke into a ripple of quiet laughter. "I am afraid my father has misled you with his irreverent expressions. He will have to atone by explaining." "You see, Doctor," said Mr. Bellingham, "Ruth is a literary searcher." "Oh, don't call me a searcher," Miss Bellingham protested. "It suggests the female searcher at a police station. Say investigator." "Very well, investigator or investigatrix, if you like. She hunts up references and bibliographies at the museum for people who are writing books. She looks up everything that has been written on a given subject, and then, when she has crammed herself to bursting point with facts, she goes to her client and disgorges and crams him or her, and he or she finally disgorges into the press." "What a disgusting way to put it," said his daughter. "However, that is what it amounts to. I am a literary jackal, a collector of provender for the literary lions. Is that quite clear?" "Perfectly, but I don't think that even now I quite understand about the stuffed shepherd kings." "Oh, it was not the shepherd kings who were to be stuffed. It was the author. That was mere obscurity of speech on the part of my father. The position is this. A venerable archdeacon wrote an article on the patriarch Joseph." "And didn't know anything about him," interrupted Mr. Bellingham, "and got tripped up by a specialist who did, and then got shirty." "Nothing of the kind," said Miss Bellingham. "He knew as much as venerable archdeacons ought to know, but the expert knew more. So the archdeacon commissioned me to collect the literature on the state of Egypt at the end of the 17th dynasty, which I have done, and tomorrow I shall go and stuff him, as my father expresses it, and then—" "And then," Mr. Bellingham interrupted, "the archdeacon will rush forth and pelt that expert with shepherd kings and Sekhen and Ra and the whole ragtag and bobtail of the 17th dynasty. Oh, there'll be wigs on the green, I can tell you." "Yes, I expect there will be quite a lively little skirmish," said Miss Bellingham. And thus dismissing the subject, she made an energetic attack on the toast, while her father refreshed himself with a colossal yawn. I watched her with furtive admiration and deep and growing interest. In spite of her pallor, her weary eyes, and her drawn and almost haggard face, she was an exceedingly handsome girl, and there was in her aspect a suggestion of purpose, of strength and character that marked her off from the rank and file of womanhood. I noted this as I stole an occasional glance at her, or turned to answer some remark addressed to me, and I noted too that her speech, despite a general undertone of depression, was yet not without a certain caustic, ironical humor. She was certainly a rather enigmatical young person, but very decidedly interesting. When she had finished her repast, she put aside the tray, and opening the shabby handbag, asked, "Do you take any interest in Egyptian history? We are as mad as hatters on the subject. It seems to be a family complaint." "I don't know much about it," I answered. "Medical studies are rather engrossing, and don't leave much time for general reading." "Naturally," she said. "You can't specialize in everything. But if you would care to see how the business of a literary jackal is conducted, I will show you my notes." I accepted the offer eagerly, not, I fear, from pure enthusiasm for the subject, and she brought forth from the bag 4 blue-covered quarto notebooks, each dealing with one of the 4 dynasties from the 14th to the 17th. As I glanced through the neat and orderly extracts with which they were filled, we discussed the intricacies of the peculiarly difficult and confused period that they covered, gradually lowering our voices as Mr. Bellingham's eyes closed and his head fell back against the back of his chair. We had just reached the critical reign of Apepa II when a resounding snore broke in upon the studious quiet of the room and sent us both into a fit of silent laughter. "Your conversation has done its work," she whispered as I stealthily picked up my hat, and together we stole on tiptoe to the door, which she opened without a sound. Once outside, she suddenly dropped her bantering manner and said quite earnestly, "How kind it was of you to come and see him tonight. You have done him a world of good, and I am most grateful. Good night." She shook hands with me really cordially, and I took my way down the creaking stairs in a whirl of happiness that I was quite at a loss to account for. End of Chapter 4.